Not ready. Those two words scrawled in red ink meant Dr. Vivienne Ashworth, the university's infamous ice queen, had just failed my thesis. Again, I was sitting on my cramped apartment floor at 11 p.m., mourning the end of my academic career, when someone knocked. I looked through the peephole, and my heart stopped. It was her, standing in the freezing rain, dripping wet. And when I finally opened the door, her first words were, "The rejection letter sat on top of the thesis draft like a verdict." Emily Hart stared at the single line scrawled in red ink across the title page, her stomach folding into a knot she had carried for the better part of 2 years. Not ready. See me. Thursday. Not try again, not close, but needs revision. Just those 4 words followed by the tidy, merciless signature she had come to recognize in her nightmares, V. Ashworth. Emily had spent 11 months writing this thesis. She had spent 11 months reading every book in the comparative literature section of Butler Library, triple-checking her citations, rewriting her introduction so many times that the first page was soft and worn at the edges like fabric. She had done everything a good graduate student was supposed to do. And for the second time in 8 months, Dr. Vivienne Ashworth had looked at the fruit of all that labor and decided it was not ready. The word hung in the air of her tiny Morningside Heights apartment. Not ready. Not good enough. Not worth the paper it was printed on. She closed the door, leaned back against it, and slid down until she was sitting on the cold, scuffed floor. A box of ginger cookies sat on the low coffee table beside her laptop, and she reached for one without getting up. The sharp, spicy sweetness did nothing to loosen the tightness in her chest, but it was familiar. And familiar was something she needed right now. Her roommate, Alice, was out at her shift at the cafe, so Emily let herself sit in the silence and feel the full weight of what had just happened. 2 rejections. 2 semesters pushed back. At this rate, she would not graduate next spring. She would not graduate at all, probably, unless she figured out what Dr. Ashworth actually wanted from her. The problem was the "huh" in "she," that she had no idea. No one did. Dr. Vivienne Ashworth was something of a legend in the comparative literature department. 38 years old, the youngest tenured professor in Columbia's history, department chair, editorial board member of 3 prestigious journals, and the author of a monograph on narrative silence that had been cited over 1,000 times. Students called her the ice queen of Butler Hall, though never to her face. She was beautiful in the way a marble statue is beautiful, all sharp cheekbones and pale, precise features, and she wore her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look even more unapproachable than she already was. Her office hours were famously brutal. A queue of nervous students formed outside her door every Tuesday afternoon, and they emerged looking shell-shocked, clutching their marked-up drafts like war wounds. She had a reputation for one-line verdicts delivered in a cool, low voice that made you feel like the smallest person in the room. "Interesting," she would say, and you would not know if she meant your argument was brilliant or a train wreck. Usually a train wreck. Emily had been in her office exactly twice. Both times had been disasters of a similar kind. She had tripped over the doorframe on the way in, spilled tea on the carpet, and then spent 20 minutes trying to explain her thesis while Dr. Ashworth sat perfectly still behind her enormous oak desk, her dark eyes fixed on Emily with an expression that could have been either deep concentration or mild horror. She had never been able to tell which. And now, Thursday, she had to go back. She had to sit in that chair again, under that gaze, and listen to Dr. Ashworth explain everything that was wrong with her work, everything that was wrong with her thinking. Everything that was wrong with her. The thought made her want to crawl under her bed and stay there until the semester ended. Instead, she ate another ginger cookie, opened her laptop, and pulled up her thesis document. The red ink of Dr. Ashworth's comments spattered the margins like tiny wounds. Unclear methodology. This argument is circular. Source analysis is shallow. See me. Thursday. She closed the laptop again. She could not look at it anymore tonight. Outside her window, the October rain had started, a steady gray drizzle that blurred the streetlights and turned the city into a watercolor painting. Emily watched it for a while, her forehead pressed against the cool glass. She thought about calling her mother, who would tell her gently that maybe this was a sign. Maybe she should have studied something more practical. Maybe she should come home to Ohio and give up on this New York dream. She thought about calling her advisor, but her advisor was the problem. So she sat alone in her small apartment, with her rejected thesis and her ginger cookies and the sound of rain against the window, and she let herself feel sorry for herself for exactly 1 hour. At 10:47 p.m., someone knocked on her door. Emily frowned. She was not expecting anyone. Alice had her own key and usually texted before she came home anyway. It was too late for a delivery, and no one in the building was the type to pop by unannounced. She pulled herself up off the floor, brushed cookie crumbs off her jeans, and shuffled to the door. She looked through the peephole and went very still. Standing in the dim hallway light, holding a battered leather briefcase and a red umbrella that had clearly failed to keep her dry, was Dr. Vivienne Ashworth. Her dark hair had come loose from its usual tight down and was plastered to her temples in wet strands. Her trench coat was dark with rain at the shoulders. She looked, for the first time in the 2 years Emily had been her student, almost human. Emily opened the door. Her hand was shaking, but she did not notice. "Dr. Ashworth," she said. Her voice came out as a croak. What are you doing here?" Vivienne Ashworth looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Water dripped from the edge of the umbrella onto the worn floorboards of the hallway. Then she said, her voice lower and softer than Emily had ever heard it, "I read your thesis again tonight. The whole thing. Twice." Emily's heart stopped. "You did? I was wrong to say it wasn't ready." Vivienne's jaw tightened. A strand of wet hair fell across her cheek, and she did not brush it away. "There are problems. Real ones. But the core of your argument—" She stopped, and something flickered across her face, so quick Emily almost missed it. "The core is good. It's more than good." Emily stood there, frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. The Ice Queen of Butler Hall, standing in her doorway at 11 p.m. in the rain, telling her that her thesis was more than good. "I want to help you fix it," Vivienne said. There was something almost raw in her voice, a crack in the marble facade that Emily had never seen before. "Not as your professor. I mean, I am your professor, but I want to help you properly, if you'll let me." The rain fell harder, the hallway light flickered. Emily looked at her professor, standing there dripping wet and strangely vulnerable, and she did not know what to say. "Please," Vivienne said, and the word was so unexpected, so unlike everything Emily knew about her, that it broke something loose in her thick chest. "Okay," Emily said. "Come in." Emily closed the door behind her professor and immediately regretted it. The apartment was small, and Vivienne Ashworth dripping rainwater onto the worn doormat seemed to take up all the air in it. "I should have called first," Vivienne said, running a hand through her wet hair. It was the first time Emily had seen her without it perfectly pinned back. It fell past her shoulders, darker when wet, and it made her look younger, almost human. I don't usually show up at students' doors." Emily realized she was still holding her mug of cold tea. She set it down on the counter. "Do you want a towel?" "Yes, thank you." The towel exchange was absurdly formal. Two women navigating a situation neither had a script for. Emily handed over a faded blue towel from her back drawer, and Vivienne dried her face with careful, methodical strokes. The gesture was so ordinary, so domestic, that Emily had to look away. "I made tea earlier," Emily said, filling the silence. "It's probably cold, but I can heat it up." "That would be lovely." The kettle hummed. Vivienne stood in the middle of Emily's living room, still holding the towel, looking at the overflowing bookshelf against the wall. Emily watched her scan the spines, a private panic rising in her chest. There were romance novels on that shelf. A lot of them. "You collect vintage paperbacks?" Vivienne said. It was not a question. Emily's face went warm. "Yeah, the covers are pretty. I know it's not, academically respectable." "It's charming." Vivienne turned back to her. There was something almost soft in her expression, there and gone. My mother collected them. Old Harlequin editions. She'd hid them behind the encyclopedia set. Emily did not know what to do with this information. Vivienne Ashworth had a mother who hid romance novels. The Ice Queen had a childhood. The kettle clicked off. Emily poured the hot water over a fresh tea bag and handed the mug to Vivienne, who accepted it with both hands. It was the first time Emily had seen her hold anything without purpose, without the sharp efficiency that defined her lecture style. "You don't have to do this, you know," Emily said. The words came out before she could stop them. "Show up. Help me. I know I'm not your favorite student. I know my thesis is a mess. You wrote 'not ready' twice, and honestly, you were right both times." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the tea in her hands, then at Emily, and there was something in her eyes that Emily could not name. "I write 'not ready' on a lot of theses," Vivienne said slowly. "It's a standard rejection. It means revise and resubmit. It doesn't mean hopeless. Feels the same from this side." "I know." Vivienne's voice was lower now. "I know it does. And I could have been clearer. I should have been clearer. That's part of why I'm here." Emily sat down on the edge of her couch, her knees suddenly weak. The rain had slowed outside, a steady patter against the window. The apartment felt smaller with Vivienne in it, but not in a bad way. More like the walls had moved closer to hold the moment. "The problem with your thesis," Vivienne said, sitting down across from Emily in the worn armchair that Emily's cat usually claimed, "is not the writing. The writing is competent. The structure is sound. The research is thorough." Emily braced herself. Here it came, the list of failures. "The problem is that you're arguing against the wrong people." Emily blinked. "What?" Vivienne leaned forward, setting her mug on the coffee table between the towel. The towel was draped over her shoulders now, and without her usual armor of a tailored blazer and heels, she looked almost approachable. Almost. "You're writing as if you need to defend your thesis against every dead white male critic in the Western canon," Vivienne said. "You're spending chapters apologizing for your methodology, preemptively dismantling arguments no one has made yet. You're so busy protecting yourself that you never let your own voice through." Emily opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's not— "You're a brilliant writer, Emily. The evidence is in every paragraph you've buried under footnotes. But you're so afraid of being wrong that you've forgotten to be interesting." Something cracked in Emily's chest. It was the same crack that had opened when Vivienne said "please" at the door, but deeper now, wider. She felt tears prick at her eyes and tried to blink them back. She had not cried in front of a professor since her undergraduate years, and she was not about to start now. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice breaking anyway. "I'm sorry, that's the nicest thing anyone said about my work in 2 years. And it came out as a criticism." Vivienne's expression shifted. It was subtle, a softening around the eyes, but Emily caught it, because she was looking for it, looking for any sign that this was real, that the Ice Queen was actually sitting in her apartment at midnight telling her she was brilliant. "Don't apologize," Vivienne said quietly. "For anything. Not tonight." Emily laughed, a wet, broken sound. "That's going to be hard. It's kind of my whole personality." "Well," Vivienne picked up her tea and took a careful sip. "Then we'll have to work on that too." They sat in silence for a moment. The rain had stopped completer. Fleck, notice, flickly, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing on the street. Emily noticed for the first time that Vivienne's hands were shaking slightly around the mug. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. Vivienne looked up. "You can. Why did you come here? Tonight? You could have waited until Thursday. You could have just emailed me your notes. You've never—" Emily hesitated. "You've never done anything like this before?" Vivienne set the mug down. She stared at Emily for a long moment, and Emily had the strange sense that she was being weighed, measured, seen in a way she had never been seen before. "Because I read your thesis again tonight," Vivienne said. "All of it. Twice, and I realized that I've been reading a lot of work for a lot of years, and it's been a long time since anything made me feel the way your second chapter made me feel." Emily's heart stopped. "My second chapter? The one about the letters?" Vivienne's voice was barely above a whisper. "The correspondence between the two women writers, the way you read their silences, the way you understood what they weren't saying to each other." Emily did not know what to say. That chapter was the one she had written in a fever dream of 3 sleepless nights, the one she had been most proud of and most terrified of. It was the chapter that felt like it had come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere she did not usually let people see. "I underlined 3 paragraphs," Vivienne said, "and I wrote this in the margin. I don't usually write this. I don't usually write anything that personal on a student's work." "Why?" Vivienne looked away. For a moment, Emily thought she saw something flicker in her eyes, something raw and quickly hidden. "Because it reminded me," Vivienne said carefully, "of a piece of writing I read a long time ago by someone She stopped, started again. "Never mind, it's late. We should start working on the revision plan." Emily wanted to push. She wanted to ask who, what, why, but something in Vivienne's posture told her to stop, that the door had been opened just a crack and pushing too hard would slam it shut. "Okay," Emily said instead. "Thursday, office hours, I'll bring the revised outline." Vivienne stood and Emily stood with her. They were closer than they had been. The space between them filled with something new, something fragile and unnamed. "Emily," Vivienne said, pausing at the door, "I mean it, about the 2nd chapter. It's not just good, it's important." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes again. She swallowed them down. "Thank you, Dr. Ashworth." Vivienne's hand was on the doorknob. She hesitated, turned back. "Vivienne," she said, "when we're not in class, you can call me Vivienne." And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Emily standing alone in her apartment with a warm mug in her hands and the impossible weight of what had just happened pressing against her ribs. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk and read her 2nd chapter 3 times, and every time she got to the paragraphs she had written about the unsent letters, about the space between the words being where the truth lived, she heard Vivienne's voice saying, "It's important." And she thought, for the first time in 2 years, that maybe she could actually do this. The next morning there was an email in her inbox. Subject line, "Thursday 2 p.m., my office, bring your courage." It was signed, V. Emily spent the next 2 days trying very hard not to think about Thursday. She failed spectacularly. She thought about it while making her morning tea, while pretending to read a journal article on 19th century epistolary fiction, while standing in the shower and wondering what exactly one wore to a meeting with a professor who had seen you cry and then told you your work mattered. She settled on her navy sweater, the one with the small hole in the elbow that she kept meaning to mend, and a pair of jeans that were neither too formal nor too casual. She stood in front of the mirror for 11 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than her usual routine, before deciding she was being ridiculous and leaving. She stopped at the coffee cart on 116th Street, ordered a large tea with milk and 2 sugars, and then, on impulse, a second one. She looked at the 2 cups in her hands and felt heat rise to her cheeks for no reason at all. "It's not for me," she muttered to no one. The barista raised an eyebrow and handed her a small paper bag of ginger cookies. "On the house," he said. "You look like you need them." She almost laughed. She was a walking cliché of a graduate student. Anxious, undercaffeinated, and emotionally invested in the approval of a woman who had rejected her work twice. She walked across campus with the 2 cups, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, her mind racing through possible opening lines for the meeting. But when she reached the old brick building that housed the comparative literature department, she stopped. The door to Vivienne's office was closed. The hallway was empty. She could hear the muffled sound of a lecture from somewhere down the corridor, the distant hum of a printer. And there it was, the small ledge beside the door where students sometimes left forgotten flyers and abandoned coffee cups. She placed the second tea on the ledge. She added the paper bag of ginger cookies. She hesitated, then wrote on a napkin in her careful, rounded handwriting, "For your afternoon." She did not sign it. She told herself it was because she didn't want to make it weird. She told herself a lot of things as she walked into the meeting, her own tea warming her hands, her heart pounding a strange, guilty rhythm. Vivienne was already at her desk, a stack of papers in front of her, a single fountain pen in her hand. She looked up when Emily entered, and there was something softer about her posture than the last time they had met, less armored. She wore a dark green cardigan over a cream blouse, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and Emily had to look away, because it felt like seeing something she wasn't supposed to see. "Sit," Vivienne said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I've restructured your argument for Chapter 3. The scaffolding was sound, but you buried your strongest point in the middle of a paragraph about secondary sources. It needs to be the opening claim." Emily blinked. "You restructured it?" "I made notes." Vivienne pushed a stack of pages across the desk. "You don't need me to rewrite your work. You need me to show you where your best ideas are hiding from you." The words landed somewhere deep in Emily's chest. She took the pages and looked at them, at the neat marginal annotations in Vivienne's sharp handwriting, at the arrows connecting one paragraph to another, at the small underlined note at the top of the third page. "This is the heart of your thesis. Trust it." She did not cry. She was very proud of that. They worked for 2 hours. Emily read aloud, Vivienne interrupted. They argued about a single sentence for 20 minutes, until Emily finally understood what Vivienne was asking her to do. And the moment she rephrased it, Vivienne nodded once and said, "Yes." Just that. Just one word. But it felt like sunlight. Near the end of the session, Vivienne stood to retrieve a book from the shelf, and her elbow caught the edge of the stack of papers, sending them sliding across the desk. Emily reached out to catch them, and for a moment their hands almost touched. Vivienne pulled back first. There was a beat of silence, and then Emily noticed something on the top page of her own draft, a section she had written 2 months ago. It was a citation, tucked into the footnotes, referencing a paper from a 2009 issue of a small academic journal. She had found it in the library archive by accident, and it had shaped her entire second chapter. Vivienne's eyes had found the same footnote. Her hand hovered over the page. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers had gone very still. "This citation," Vivienne said quietly. "Where did you find this paper?" "The archive," Emily said. "It was in the basement stacks. It wasn't in the database. I had to request it from off-site storage. It's about the correspondence between 2 women writers in the 1920s and how their letters to each other functioned as a kind of hidden literary conversation that neither of them could have in public." "I'd never seen anything like it." Vivienne said nothing for a long moment. Her hand moved away from the page. She looked at Emily, and there was something raw in her eyes, something that made Emily's breath catch. "Good research," Vivienne said finally. Her voice was steady, but quieter than usual. "That's a very rare source. I'm surprised you found it." "Is it important?" Emily asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Vivienne looked at her. The moment stretched. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust motes in the air, catching the faint lines at the corners of Vivienne's eyes. "Yes," she said, "it's important." The bell rang. The meeting was over. Emily gathered her things, her hands clumsy, her mind spinning. As she reached the door, she turned back. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it." Vivienne nodded. "Same time next week." Outside the office, on the ledge, the teacup was still there, but the napkin was gone. Emily didn't know what to make of that. The next morning, there was a note in her department mailbox. Not an email, a physical note, written in the same sharp handwriting that had marked up her thesis, on a small card with the university crest at the top. "Come by Friday. I found your problem." It was signed, not with an initial, but with a name. Vivienne. Emily read it 4 times. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She did not tell herself it was just about the thesis. She was done lying to herself about that. Friday came faster than Emily expected. She spent the whole day at her desk in the graduate student office pretending to work, actually staring at the folded note in her pocket. She had read it so many times the creases were starting to soften. "Come by Friday. I found your problem." At 7:05, she knocked on the door of Dr. Ashworth's office. The hallway was quiet. Most of the lights were off. A faint glow spilled from beneath the door, and when it opened, Vivienne was holding a stack of papers in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. She was wearing a dark green sweater instead of her usual blazer, and her hair was loose, not in the tight knot she wore for lectures.
Good, Vivienne said, stepping aside. You're on time. Come in. The
Vice was different at night. Softer. The window faced west, and the last of the daylight painted the bookshelves in shades of amber and rust. The desk was still covered in neat piles of work, but there was also a small plate with 2 shortbread cookies on it, and Emily noticed, with a tiny jolt, that one of them was already gone. Sit, Vivienne said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. She didn't sit down herself. Instead, she leaned against the edge of the desk, which made her closer to Emily than she ever was during office hours. I read your revised chapter 4 times. The argument about the letters is strong. The framing around the suffragist movement is solid, but there's a structural weakness in the transition between your 2nd and 3rd sections. Emily pulled out her notebook, pen ready. Okay? Here. Vivienne turned the stack of papers around and pointed at a paragraph near the middle of the page. Her sleeve brushed Emily's wrist. Neither of them acknowledged it. You're making a claim about the intimacy of the correspondence, but you haven't yet shown the reader what that intimacy looked like. You're telling, not showing. The primary sources are there. Use them. Emily nodded, making notes. I can quote more directly from the letters. Yes, but that's not the whole fix. Vivienne straightened, and for a moment she looked almost uncertain. The problem isn't just the chapter. It's the connective tissue across your whole thesis. You have one strong thread running through it, but it's buried. I think you need to see it on a larger scale. She crossed the room and pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. When she opened it, Emily saw a hand-drawn map of her entire thesis structure. Every chapter, every subsection, every argument, mapped out in Vivienne's precise handwriting, with arrows and annotations in red pen. I made this last night, Vivienne said, her voice carefully neutral. It's a skeleton of your argument. The spine is there. But you've been writing around it instead of through it. Emily stared at the map. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for her academic work. It was also, unmistakably, the work of someone who had spent hours alone at a desk thinking about her. Not her thesis. Her. Dr. Ashworth, Emily said quietly. This must have taken you... Don't. Vivienne held up a hand, not looking at her. It's part of the job. It's not part of the job, Emily said. I've been a student for a long time. I know what's part of the job. This isn't that. The silence stretched between them. Vivienne's jaw tightened, and she turned slightly toward the window, as if she could escape the weight of her own kindness. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, warmer. Let's go to the library, Vivienne said abruptly. I want to show you something. The library at that hour was a different world. The great reading room was almost empty, lit by low green lamps and the cold glow of computer screens. The air smelled of old paper and floor polish, and something like dust and rain. Vivienne walked ahead of Emily, weaving between shelves with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of this building by heart. She stopped at a stack near the back of the 4th floor, in a section Emily had never explored. This is the Rare Periodicals Archive, Vivienne said, pulling a thin volume from the shelf. The journal you cited in your 2nd chapter. The essay on the 2 poets' correspondence. It's not digitized. Emily stepped closer. Wait, you mean the 2009 paper? How did you... I know the archive, Vivienne's voice was clipped. She opened the journal, her fingers finding the page without hesitation, and held it out to Emily. Read the 3rd paragraph, the one about the letters they exchanged during the summer of 1924. Emily took the volume carefully. The paper was brittle. The ink faded. She found the paragraph, read it, and went still. The argument was almost identical to her own, but it was stated with a clarity and confidence she had been reaching for all semester. It was like reading the version of her thesis that already existed in her head. She looked up, and Vivienne was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. This is exactly where I wanted to go with the 3rd section, Emily said. I didn't know it had already been written. I mean, not this directly. Who wrote this? Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. She took the journal back, closed it, and ran her thumb along the spine. Someone who was very good, she said finally. She understood those letters better than anyone I've ever known. Emily waited. Vivienne didn't elaborate. There was something in the way she held the journal, the careful tenderness of her fingers, that made Emily think of the way people touch things they no longer have. She didn't push. She had learned enough about this woman to know that pushing only made her retreat. "It's late," Vivienne said. She put the journal back on the shelf, but not before her thumb rested on the cover for a second longer than necessary. "We should get back to the draft." They returned to the office, and Vivienne cleared a space on the desk. They worked side by side, Emily in the chair, Vivienne standing beside her, leaning in every so often to point at a sentence or underline a phrase. The distance between them was small and getting smaller. At one point, Vivienne reached across Emily to retrieve a pen, and her sleeve brushed Emily's shoulder. At another, they both reached for the same page at the same time, their fingers nearly touching before they both pulled back. Then it happened. Vivienne was leaning in to look at the screen, close enough that Emily could smell her coffee and something else, something clean and faintly floral. Her hair, loose and dark, slipped over her shoulder and grazed Emily's cheek. Just once, a whisper of contact. They both froze. Vivienne straightened. "Sorry," she said, and her voice was almost too quiet. "It's okay," Emily said, and her own voice came out steadier than she expected. She did not say that she had felt it. She did not say that the spot on her cheek still felt like it was holding the warmth. She just looked at the screen and waited for the world to settle back into its normal shape. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. Then she moved to sit on the edge of the desk, closer than before, and said, "When I was writing my dissertation, my advisor rejected my first full draft. Said it was ambitious but unworkable. I nearly dropped out." Emily turned to look at her. "You did?" "No one knows that." Vivienne's voice was flat, careful. "I didn't have a plan B. I was going to be a professor, or nothing. So I stayed in the library for 3 weeks, rewrote the whole thing, and got it right the second time. I've never told anyone that story. Why are you telling me?" Vivienne looked at her, and for just a moment the frost in her eyes was gone. "Because I think you need to know that I understand what it feels like to be told you're not good enough, and I think you need to know that you are." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and bright. Emily felt something crackle the think in her chest, small and warm and terrifying. "I should go," Emily said, standing, because she didn't trust herself to stay in that room for one more second without saying something she couldn't take back. "It's late. I'll finish the transition section this weekend." Vivienne nodded. She didn't walk her to the door this time. She just stood by the desk watching her go. At the threshold, Emily paused. "Vivienne?" The use of her first name made Vivienne go very still. "The library," Emily said. "The person who wrote that paper. She was important to you, wasn't she?" Vivienne didn't answer for a long time. Then, so quietly Emily almost missed it, she said, "Yes, she was." Emily walked out into the empty hallway, her heart beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. She did not look back. She did not trust herself to. Emily's apartment smelled like garlic and basil and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify until she realized it was the orange peels she'd left drying on the windowsill 3 days ago. She'd forgotten she had a windowsill. She'd forgotten she had oranges. For a week straight, her world had been nothing but her thesis and the terrifying magnetic pull of her professor's attention. And now that professor was standing in her living room holding a thick manila folder, looking at the stack of unread library books on her coffee table like they were a personal offense. "You live here," Vivienne said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation delivered with the same clinical precision she used to dissect a weak paragraph. Emily laughed, a little breathless. "That's what the lease says. Your thesis draft. The one I marked up." Vivienne held out the folder. "You left it in my office yesterday. I thought you might want it before the weekend." Emily took it, her fingers brushing Vivienne's for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, but she felt it in her chest, warm and electric. "You didn't have to bring it all the way here. I could have picked it up Monday. I was in the neighborhood." Emily didn't point out that Vivienne lived on the Upper West Side and her apartment was in Morningside Heights, which was not, by any stretch of the imagination, in the neighborhood. She also didn't point out that it was a Saturday evening and that Vivienne was still wearing her work clothes, a charcoal blazer over a cream silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a low bun that had started to loosen at the edges. Instead, she said, "Are you hungry?" Vivienne blinked. It was the most unguarded expression Emily had ever seen on her face. "What?" "I made too much pasta. It's just pen with tomato sauce and whatever vegetables were in my fridge, which is not a glamorous sentence, but it's edible. You could stay if you want. The words came out faster than Emily had intended, and she felt her cheeks warm. She was asking her professor to stay for dinner, her professor who had failed her thesis twice, who had shown up at her door with marked-up pages on a Saturday night, who had looked at her in the library yesterday with something raw and unguarded in her eyes. Vivienne looked at the folder in Emily's hands. She looked at the kitchen, where a pot of pasta sat cooling on the stove. She looked at the couch, an old floral print thing that Emily had bought at a thrift store for $40, with a lumpy cushion and a permanent dent in the middle. "I don't want to intrude," Vivienne said, but she didn't move toward the door. "You're not intruding. I'm offering." Emily set the folder on the coffee table and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a stick and plate from the cabinet without asking. "Sit. I'll reheat the sauce. It's better when it's had time to sit anyway." Vivienne stood there for a long moment, and Emily could feel her hesitating from across the room. Then, slowly, like a woman approaching a wild animal she wasn't sure wouldn't bite, Vivienne crossed the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. Emily tried not to stare. She failed. It was strange, seeing Vivienne in her apartment. Her professor had always seemed like a creature of institutional spaces, of lecture halls and office hours and library archives, a woman who existed in the fluorescent hum of academia. But here, on the lumpy thrift store couch, backlit by the orange glow of Emily's second-hand lamp, she looked almost ordinary, almost human. "Here," Emily set a plate in her lap. "I hope you like garlic." "I do." "Good, because I used a lot of it." Vivienne took a bite. Emily watched her chew, watched her swallow, watched her take a second bite before setting the fork down. "This is good," she said, and it sounded like a confession. Emily sat next to her, close enough that their knees almost touched. The space between them was charged, humming with everything they hadn't said yet. "I've been thinking," Emily said carefully, "about what you told me in the library, about your advisor and the thesis." Vivienne's jaw tightened. She stared at the plate in her hands. "I shouldn't have told you that." "Why not?" "Because it's not your problem. It's old history." "Vivienne." Emily said her name softly, the way she'd done in the library, and watched the tension ripple through her professor's shoulders. "You told me you almost quit. You told me you know what it's like to be told you're not good enough. That's not old history. That's a scar. And I may not think to understand it." Vivienne set the plate down on the coffee table. She folded her hands in her lap, knuckles white. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, like she was reading from a transcript of her own wounds. "My advisor was a man named Dr. Harold Pemberton. He was brilliant and cruel in equal measure. He believed that the only way to produce great scholars was to break them down first, to make them prove they could rebuild themselves from the rubble." She paused. "I was 26. I had just moved to New York. I didn't know anyone. I had this idea for a thesis about the way women writers used letters to create intimacy across distance, how the physical act of writing bridged the gap that geography created." Emily felt her breath catch. She'd read Vivienne's first book, the one that had made her name in the field. It was about exactly that. He read my first chapter and called it sentimental drivel. He said my analysis was the intellectual equivalent of a greeting card. He told me that if I couldn't produce something with actual scholarly merit by the end of the semester, I should consider another profession. Vivienne's voice didn't waver, but Emily saw her hands trembling. "I spent 3 weeks in my apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, rewriting the same chapter over and over and over again. Every version came back with the same red ink. Not ready, not good enough. This is why women don't get tenure." "Jesus," Emily breathed. "I was ready to quit. I had a suitcase half packed. I was going to call my mother and tell her I was moving back to Ohio, that academia wasn't for me, that I'd made a terrible mistake." Vivienne looked at Emily, and for the first time, Emily saw something fragile in her eyes, something she'd never imagined could if stood behind that ice-cold exterior. "And then, one day, a friend of mine, a fellow grad student, she found me in the library at midnight, crying over my marked-up draft. She didn't say anything. She just sat down next to me, pulled out a pen, and started helping me rewrite the first paragraph. Line by line, sentence by sentence. She stayed until 3 in the morning." Emily's throat tightened. She knew, somehow, that the friend in this story was the woman who had written that 2009 paper. She knew it in her bones. She told me I was good enough. Not that I was brilliant, not that I was destined for greatness, just that I was good enough to keep going. Vivienne's voice cracked, just slightly, and that was all I needed to hear. Someone saying it out loud, someone seeing me. The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken pain. Emily didn't know what to say. She wanted to reach out to touch Vivienne's hand, to do something to bridge the distance between them. But she was afraid of overstepping, afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was forming between them. "Is that why you're so hard on your students?" Emily asked quietly. "Because you're trying to make them stronger?" Vivienne shook her head. "I don't know why I'm like this. Marcus would say it's because I'm emotionally constipated." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone. "Maybe it's because I'm afraid that if I let myself care too much, I'll lose myself again. I spent so long building walls after that thesis, walls around my work, around my life, and they've served me well." Until now, Vivienne didn't answer. She just looked at Emily. And in that look, Emily saw something terrifying and beautiful. Something that looked almost like hope. "Vivienne," Emily said softly, "the woman who helped you that night, the one who wrote that paper, she was the one you were thinking about in the library, wasn't she?" Vivienne's breath caught. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes." "What happened to her?" Vivienne looked away. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "She's gone." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She'd expected many things, but not this. Not the quiet devastation in Vivienne's voice, the way her hands had gone completely still in her lap, the way her whole body seemed to fold inward, like she was trying to disappear. "I'm sorry," Emily said, and she meant it with every cell in her body. "I shouldn't have asked." "No." Vivienne's voice was steadier now, but there was a rawness in it that hadn't been there before. "You should know. You're the first person I've told about this in years. The first student I've ever let see this part of me." "Why me?" Vivienne looked at her, and the answer was written all over her face, even though she didn't say it out loud. She just shook her head, a small, sad movement, and stood up. "I should go. I've already overstayed my welcome." "You haven't," Emily said, standing too. "You can stay. We can talk more. Or we can not talk. We can just, I don't know, sit here." Vivienne paused at the door. She looked back at Emily, and for a moment, Emily saw something in her eyes that looked like longing. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of composure. "Finish your thesis, Emily. That's what matters now." "Vivienne, thank you for the pasta." Vivienne opened the door. "It was the best meal I've had in a long time." And then she was gone, leaving Emily standing in the doorway of her small, warm apartment, watching the stairwell where her professor had just disappeared. He screamed flume before he didn't know how to ask. The week after the pasta dinner, Emily felt like she was floating. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vivienne sitting on her worn-out couch, fork halfway to her mouth saying, "It was the best meal I've had in a long time." The memory was warm, almost tender. She caught herself smiling at nothing in the campus coffee shop and had to physically shake her head to snap out of it. But the float didn't last. On Tuesday morning, Emily walked into the graduate seminar room for her weekly thesis check-in and found 3 unfamiliar faces seated at the table. Dr. Patricia Eng from the English department, Dr. Robert Chen from history, and Dr. Marcus Webb, who gave her a look she couldn't quite read, half warning, half sympathy. "Ms. Hart," Dr. Eng said, gesturing to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Please, sit. We wanted to have a brief conversation about your thesis progress." Emily sat. Her hands were cold. This wasn't a standard check-in. Standard check-ins happened with her advisor, one-on-one, in a cramped office with too many books. A committee spanning 3 departments meant something else entirely. "We've reviewed your latest draft," Dr. Chen said, flipping through a stack of papers that Emily recognized as her own work. Her words, her months of labor, sitting in someone else's hands. "And we have some concerns about the direction you're taking." "Concerns?" Emily heard her own voice come out smaller than she intended. "The comparative framework between Victorian sentimental fiction and contemporary trauma narratives," Dr. N said, tapping her pen against the table. "It's ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for a master's thesis."
We're wondering if you might consider narrowing your scope. Emily felt the
Words land like stones in her stomach, narrowing her scope. That was polite academic language for, "This is too much, you can't handle it." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "We're not saying the work isn't promising," Dr. Chen added, and Emily could hear the "but" coming before he even said it. "But we have to consider the timeline. You're already at risk of delaying graduation. A project this large—" "It's already been delayed twice," Emma said quietly. "I know." The committee exchanged glances. It was Marcus who finally spoke, his voice softer than the others. "Emily, nobody's trying to penalize you. We just want to make sure you have a realistic path forward." After the meeting, Emily walked out into the hallway on autopilot. She made it to the stairwell before the tears came. Hot, sudden, humiliating. She pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle the sound. Leaning against the cold cinder-block wall, she'd finally felt like she was getting somewhere, like she could actually do this. And now, Emily. She looked up. Marcus was standing at the top of the stairs, his face uncharacteristically serious. "Hey," she said, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'm fine, I just—" "Don't do that," Marcus said, walking down to stand beside her. "Don't pretend you're fine when you've just been ambushed by a committee that should know better." Emily laughed, a wet, broken sound. "Is that a professional opinion?" "Personal." Marcus leaned against the wall next to her, hands in his pockets. "Listen, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." Emily's stomach tightened. "What?" "Vivienne. Dr. Ashworth. She requested this meeting." Emily blinked. "What? No, she wouldn't. She's been helping me. She came to my apartment. I know." Marcus's voice was wiful, for awful. "I know she's been helping you, and I know she cares about your work, but that's exactly the problem." "What problem?" Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "People talk, Emily. A tenured professor who famously never takes on advisees suddenly spending evenings at a student's apartment? Making exceptions? Giving extra time? There's been chatter, and Vivienne, being who she is, decided to get ahead of it by having the committee formally review your progress." Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her. "She did this to protect herself?" "To protect both of you," Marcus corrected gently. "If it looked like she was playing favorites, it would undermine your thesis in front of the whole department. She made it official so nobody could accuse her of impropriety. And she didn't think to tell me first?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I think she was scared," he finally said. "I think she's been scared for a while now, and she doesn't know how to handle it except by doing what she does best, controlling the situation, even if it means hurting someone she—" He stopped. Emily looked at him. "Someone she what?" Marcus shook his head. "I've already said too much. Just talk to her. Ask her about the meeting. But be patient with her, Emily. She's not good at this." Emily didn't go to see Vivienne that day. She told herself she needed time to think, to process, but really she was afraid. Afraid that if she showed up at Vivienne's office, she'd see the truth in her eyes, that she was just a project, a liability, something to be managed. She stayed away for 3 days. The first day she worked on her thesis in a coffee shop, trying to convince herself that the committee's feedback was useful, that narrowing her scope wouldn't feel like cutting off her own arm. The hectic day. She didn't work at all. She lay on her couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the pasta dinner in her head. It was the best meal I've had in a long time. Had that been real? Or had she imagined the softness in Vivienne's voice, the way her shoulders had relaxed, the way she'd let herself be seen? The third day, Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "She asked about you today, in the faculty lounge. Tried to make it sound casual, it wasn't." Emily stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "I'm not ready to talk to her yet." Marcus's reply came almost instantly. "She's not good at waiting either. But she will?" On the fourth day, Emily made a decision. She marched into the faculty building with her revised thesis outline in her bag, a narrowed scope just as the committee had suggested. She wasn't going to hide from Vivienne. She wasn't going to pretend the last few weeks hadn't happened. She was going to face her. Ask her directly why she'd called that meeting without warning, and demand to know if the warmth she'd felt in her apartment had been real or just a tactic. She rehearsed the speech in her head as she walked up the stairs. By the time she reached Vivienne's office door, she had it memorized. She knocked. "Come in." Emily pushed open the door. Vivienne was at her desk, the same as always, her posture perfect, her face composed. But something was different. Her hand was wrapped around a mug of tea, and beside it, on the desk, was a small plate with a single ginger biscuit. Emily's ginger biscuit, from the tin she kept in her apartment. The words she'd rehearsed died in her throat. Vivienne looked up, and for a moment her mask slipped. Emily saw something raw in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or fear, or both. Then, it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality. "Emily," Vivienne said, "I was beginning to think you'd decided to switch advisors." "I almost did," Emily said, and watched Vivienne's jaw tighten. "But I have questions first." Vivienne set down her mug. "Ask them." Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Why did you call the committee meeting without telling me?" "Because I knew you'd be upset." "That's not an answer." Vivienne was quiet for a moment, and she said, "The committee wasn't going to approve your thesis with the current scope. I knew that. I also knew that if I brought it up in a regular meeting, you'd argue, and you'd be right, and I'd have to choose between supporting you and telling you the truth." "What truth?" Vivienne's fingers tightened around her mug. "That your thesis is too ambitious for the timeline you have, that the committee's concerns are valid, even if their delivery was brutal. And that She stopped, swallowed. "I didn't know how to tell you that I'd failed to prepare you properly." Emily stared at her. "You didn't fail me. You helped me more than anyone ever has. And yet you're still at risk of not graduating." Vivienne's voice was flat. "That's a failure, Emily, by any standard." "No." Emily shook her head. "That's not what this is. This is you pushing me away because the committee scared you, because people are talking, because being seen with me is making you uncomfortable." The words hung in the air between them. Vivienne went very still. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly. "I don't know what to think," Emily's voice cracked. "You spent an evening in my apartment. You told me things you've never told anyone. You looked at me like—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "And then you disappeared. You called a commie. Thing meted behind my back and disappeared. I was trying to protect you. From what? From me." The two words fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Vivienne looked down at her desk, and Emily saw her shoulders curve inward. Just slightly, a crack in the perfect posture. "I'm not good at this," Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not good at caring about people without breaking things. I thought if I made it official, made it professional, I could keep you at a safe distance. Keep us both safe." Emily felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by something heavier. She walked to the chair across from Vivienne's desk and sat down slowly. "Vivienne," she said, "I'm not asking you to be good at this. I'm asking you to stop deciding what's best for me without asking me first." Vivienne looked up. Her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the meeting. I'm sorry I made you think—" She stopped. "I'm sorry I made you think I was ashamed of you." Emily reached across the desk and very gently touched the back of Vivienne's hand. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said softly. "I just need you to trust me enough to let me make my own choices." Vivienne looked at Emily's hand, still hovering near hers. Then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," she said. "I'll try." The email arrived at 9:47 p.m., 3 days before the submission deadline. Emily stared at the timestamp on her laptop screen, then at the subject line, RE, Final Draft, Chapters 6 and 7. Her cursor hovered over the attachment icon. She had been revising the same 2 chapters for 11 hours. Her eyes burned. Her back ached on the kitchen chair she refused to replace because the couch was too soft and the desk chair had a broken wheel. She clicked the attachment. Vivienne's comments appeared in the margins, precise and sparse, each one a small red flag planted in her prose. The last comment was circled twice, with a single line beneath it. "This is the heart of your argument. Trust it." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She typed a reply. "Thank you. I'll revise tonight." Then she deleted the last sentence and replaced it with, "I'm on it." She didn't tell Vivienne that she had barely slept in 2 days, or that her mother had called 3 times and she had let it ring, or that she had eaten nothing but a stale bagel since breakfast. None of that was Vivienne's problem. The thesis was. The kitchen clock said 10:12 p.m. when she opened the document again. The words swam. She blinked hard and pulled the first paragraph of Chapter 7 onto her screen. The argument was there, somewhere. Under the layers of cautious hedging and over-citation, she could feel it. She just couldn't reach it. At midnight, she made tea. At 1:30 a.m., she made more tea and ate the second half of the bagel. At 2:15 a.m., she pushed the laptop away, pressed her palms into her eye sockets, and sat in the dark quiet of her apartment, listening to the radiator hiss. She would finish. She had to finish. But the words were gone and the deadline was coming, and she was so tired. At 2:40 a.m., unable to sit still, she pulled on her coat and went downstairs. The street was empty. A distant siren wailed somewhere near Broadway. The air smelled like rain and wet asphalt. She was about to turn back when she saw the shape on the bench across the street, a figure in a long, dark coat, sitting very still under the pale cone of bag stood beside them. Emily's heart stopped. She crossed the street without thinking. The figure looked up, and the streetlight caught the sharp lines of her face. "Vivienne?" Dr. Vivienne Ashworth, chair of the comparative literature department, tenured professor, academic terror of half the graduate students at Columbia, was sitting on a splintered wooden bench outside Emily's apartment building at 2 a.m, wearing an old wool coat and holding a paper bag. "I couldn't sleep," Vivienne said, as if that explained everything. Emily stood in front of her, arms crossed, shivering slightly. "You've been sitting here—" "Your light was on," Vivienne said. "At 10? At midnight? At 2. You've been sitting here since 10? Vivienne didn't answer. She looked down at the bag in her hands, then held it out. "There's a diner on Amsterdam that's open all night. I thought you might not be eating." Emily took the bag. It was warm. The smell of a sandwich and something sweet drifted out. "You walked to Amsterdam Avenue at 10 o'clock at night to get me a sandwich," Emily said slowly. "And then you came back and sat on a bench. In the dark." "Yes. Why?" Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. Her hands, gloved, rested on her knees. "Because I told you I would try," she said finally. "And I didn't know how to help you from my office. I didn't know how to help you on the phone. I only knew that you were here. And you were working, and you were probably not eating or sleeping, and I thought if I was close enough I could at least." She stopped. "I don't know what I thought." Emily sat down on the bench beside her. The wood was cold through her jeans. She opened the paper bag. A turkey sandwich on rye, a small container of coleslaw, and a slice of apple pie. The pie was still warm. "You bought me pie," Emily said. "You like baking," Vivienne said. "I thought you might like something that tasted like home, even if it wasn't homemade." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She took a bite of the sandwich and the world tipped slightly back into focus. She was hungrier than she had realized. They sat in silence for a while. The street was quiet. A few cars passed and a taxi idled at the corner before turning off. The streetlight buzzed faintly overhead. "This is weird," Emily said finally, with her mouth half full. "You sitting on a bench at 2 a.m? Me eating a sandwich in my pajamas under a streetlight." "I believe those are pajamas, yes," Vivienne said. She almost smiled. "The flannel ones." Emily felt her cheeks go warm. "You've seen these before. The night you left your thesis draft at my office, you were wearing them when you came to get it." "I remember." Emily didn't know what to do with the fact that Vivienne remembered her flannel pajamas. She ate another bite of sandwich instead. "I'm stuck," she said quietly. Chapter 7. The revision you sent back. The comment about trusting my argument. I know what I want to say, but every time I try to write it, it sounds wrong. Too big or too small. I keep circling it and I can't land. Vivienne nodded slowly. She didn't offer advice. She didn't pull out a red pen. She just sat there, listening, her profile lit by the streetlight. "Say it to me," Vivienne said. "What?" "The argument. The thing you're trying to write. Don't write it. Say it." Emily stared at her. "Out loud?" "Out loud." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at the sandwich in her hands. She took a breath. "I'm trying to argue that the way we remember a place changes the place itself," she said. Lowly. "That memory isn't just a record, it's a form of rewriting. Every time we remember, we're editing the original text, and that's not a loss. That's what makes a place real. The accumulation of all its retellings." She stopped. It sounded simpler out loud than it did on the page. Vivienne was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's your thesis," she said. "I know, I just can't." "You just wrote it," Vivienne said, "in 2 sentences, without a single citation." Emily blinked. "I did." "You've been overthinking it. The argument is sound. You've been burying it under other people's voices, but the voice that matters is yours." Emily looked at her. The streetlight caught the edge of Vivienne's jaw, the small furrow between her brows. She looked tired, too. Tired and present, and entirely focused on Emily. "Why are you here?" Emily asked again, softly this time, not accusing. Vivienne was quiet for so long that Emily thought she wasn't going to answer. Then Vivienne reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pen. It was her antique one, the black and gold fountain pen she always used for annotations. She held it out to Emily. "Because I know what it feels like to be so afraid of getting it wrong that you stop being able to write at all," Vivienne said. "And I didn't want you to go through that alone." Emily took the pen. The metal was warm from Vivienne's pocket. "I'll bring it back," Emily said. "Keep it until you're done," Vivienne said. "You can return it after the defense." Emily closed her fingers around the pen. The sandwich was half eaten in her lap. The pie was getting cold. It was almost 3 a.m, and her thesis was still a mess, and she was sitting on a bench in the dark with the most terrifying professor in her department, and who had bought her dinner and walked across the neighborhood to make sure she was okay. "Okay," Emily said. "I'll finish it. I'll write it tonight." "I know you will," Vivienne said, "but you might do it better after some sleep." "I can't sleep," Emily said. "I tried." "Then don't sleep," Vivienne said. "But eat the pie." Emily laughed. It came out cracked and tired and strangely warm. She took a bite of the pie. They sat on the bench until 3:30 a.m. Vivienne didn't talk about the thesis. She talked about the time she had locked herself out of her office in her 2nd year at Columbia and had to climb through a window in a dress and heels. And Marcus had walked by exactly at that moment. She told it dryly, with a deadpan delivery that made Emily laugh for the first time in days. When Emily finally stood up, her legs stiff from the cold, she looked down at Vivienne. "Walk me to the door?" Vivienne stood. They crossed the street together. At the bottom of the steps, Emily turned. "Thank you," she said. "For the sandwich. And the pie. And the bench." "Don't thank me," Vivienne said. "Just write the chapter. I'll read it in the morning." "You'll be here?" "I'll be in my office," Vivienne said. "Wherever you are, I'll be reading." Emily nodded. She wanted to say something else, something bigger, but the words wouldn't come. She settled for a small smile and turned toward the door. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard Vivienne's voice. "Emily?" She turned. Vivienne was still standing at the bottom of the steps, hands in her coat pockets, looking up at her. The streetlight haloed her hair. "When you write it," Vivienne said, "write it like you're telling me, like I'm the only one listening." Emily swallowed. "Okay. Good night, Emily." "Good night, Vivienne." Think inside. The apartment was still dark and quiet, the laptop still open on the kitchen table, but when she sat down, the words were there, waiting for her. She wrote until dawn. Emily sent the draft at 6:47 a.m., her eyes burned. Her hands shook slightly from the 3rd cup of tea, but the file went through with a soft whoosh that felt like the sound of her own heartbeat leaving her body. She didn't sleep. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night before. The long bench, the paper bag of warm food. Vivienne's voice saying, "Write it like you're telling me. Like I'm the only one listening." She had done exactly that. Every sentence felt like a confession. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. "Dr. Ashworth, Chapter 7 is strong. Chapter 8 needs work. The argument collapses at the midpoint. Come to my office at noon." No good morning. No acknowledgement of what happened last night. Just the red pen, back in her hand, as if the woman on the bench had never existed. Emily stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed, "I'll be there." She showered, changed into the least wrinkled shirt she owned, and walked to campus with her stomach in knots. The draft she'd poured her whole night into suddenly felt like a school assignment again. Vivienne's office door was open. She sat at her desk, reading glasses low on her nose, a fresh stack of paper beside her. Emily's paper, covered in red ink. "Close the door," Vivienne said without looking up. Emily closed it. The click of the latch felt like a verdict. "Sit." She sat. The chair was the same one she'd sat in every time, the one that made her feel like a child called to the principal's office. Vivienne slid the marked-up draft across the desk. "I read it twice," Vivienne said. "The first half is the best work you've thinkin'. The second half falls apart." Emily picked up the paper. The red ink was dense, almost violent. Paragraphs circled, arrows pointing to margins, question marks scattered like birdshot. Her chest tightened. "The midpoint," Vivienne continued. "You shift from close reading to summary. You stop arguing and start describing. It's like you ran out of breath?" "I didn't run out of breath." Emily's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I ran out of time." "Then you should have managed your time better." Something snapped. A thin wire inside Emily's chest, pulled too tight for too many weeks, finally broke. She set the paper down carefully, deliberately, and looked at Vivienne for the first time since she'd sat down. "With respect," Emily said, her voice trembling but steady, "I've been working on this thesis for 2 years. I've rewritten chapter 3 4 times. I've slept maybe 10 hours in the past 3 days. I wrote 7,000 words last night after you left. And I did it because you told me to write like you were listening. And now you're telling me I ran out of time?" Vivienne's pen stopped moving. She looked up. Her eyes were unreadable, but something flickered behind them. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Emily? No, wait." Emily's hands were shaking. She gripped the armrests of the chair to steady them. "I need to say this. I've spent 2 years being afraid of you. I've spent 2 years thinking you were cold, that you didn't care, that I was just a name on a roster you had to fail. And then you showed up at my door. You sat on a bench all night. You brought me food. You gave me your pen. Your pen, Vivienne. And I thought maybe I'd been wrong about you." She stopped. Her throat was closing, but she forced the last words out, the ones that had been burning in her chest since she read the message this morning. "But you're not helping me. You're controlling me. You give me just enough hope to keep going, and then you take it away with a red pen and a 2-word email. You don't want me to succeed. You want me to need you." The silence that followed was so complete, Emily could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Vivienne set her pen down, slowly, deliberately. She removed her glasses and placed them beside the stack of paper. For a long moment, she just looked at Emily, really looked, the way she had on the bench the night before. "Can I tell you something?" Vivienne's voice was quiet, not cold, quiet, the way she'd been at 2 a.m. "Not as your advisor, not as your professor." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. Vivienne leaned back in her chair. She looked tired, Emily realized, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I was 26, Vivienne said, my second year of grad school. I had a thesis advisor who thought I was wasting his time. He told me in front of my entire cohort that my research was cute but inconsequential. He failed my first draft. He failed my second. And then he said something to me that I've never forgotten." She paused. Her fingers traced the edge of her desk, a small, almost unconscious gesture. He said, Vivienne, you're smart. But smart isn't enough. You need to be ruthless. You need to be willing to tear your own work apart and rebuild it. If you can't do that, you should quit now and save us both the trouble. Emily's breath caught. She had never imagined Vivienne, Dr. Ashworth, the Ice Queen, the woman who made graduate students cry in office hours, being told she should quit. I didn't quit, Vivienne said. I stayed up for 3 days and rewrote the entire thesis, from scratch. I passed, I got my PhD, I got tenure, and every single paper I've written since. I've written like I was still trying to prove him wrong. She picked up her glasses, turned them over in her hands. But I never forgot how it felt, to be told that what I'd worked for wasn't good enough, that I wasn't good enough. She finally looked at Emily again. I've been telling myself I push my students because I want them to be better. But the truth is, I push them because I'm scared. I'm scared that if they fail, they'll feel the way I felt, and I'm scared that if they succeed, they won't need me anymore. Emily's heart was pounding. There it was. The thing she'd been circling for weeks, the crack in the ice, the reason Vivienne kept showing up. So when you say I'm controlling you, Vivienne said, her voice barely about to whisper, you're not wrong. I am. Because I care about you, Emily. I care about you more than I've let myself care about anyone in a long time, and I'm terrified that if I don't control yet, I'll lose you. The way I lost... She stopped, swallowed, didn't finish the sentence. Emily sat very still. The anger that had been burning in her chest had cooled into something else, something that ached. You don't have to control me, Emily said quietly. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here. Vivienne's eyes glistened. She blinked, once, and it was gone. But Emily had seen it. I know you're not, Vivienne said. I'm starting to believe it. She reached across the desk and took Emily's marked-up draft. She turned it around, face down, and pushed it aside. The midpoint problem, she said, her voice steadier now. I think you're summarizing because you're not sure what you believe yet. You're describing other people's arguments because you're afraid to make your own. Emily nodded. That was true. That was painfully true. Here's what we're going to do, Vivienne said. You're going to tell me, out loud, right now, what you actually think about Chapter 8. Not what the secondary sources say. What you think. And I'm going to listen. No red pen. No interruptions. Emily looked at her, the woman who had failed her thesis twice. The woman who had sat on a bench all night. The woman who had just admitted she was terrified of losing her. Okay, Emily said. Okay. She opened her mouth, and the words came. Emily spoke for 11 minutes. She did not plan it. She did not outline it. She simply opened her mouth, and the argument that had been buried under 2 years of fear and footnotes and self-doubt came out in a voice she hardly recognized. She talked about the way memory works in narrative, about how the gaps in a story are not absences but structures, about how the silences between words hold more meaning than the words themselves, if you are brave enough to sit in them. She did not look at Vivienne. She looked at the window, at the rain that had started again, at the steam rising from the teacup she had not touched. She talked until she ran out of words, and then she stopped, and her hands were shaking. Vivienne did not say anything for a long moment. Then she picked up the red pen. Emily felt her stomach drop, but Vivienne did not uncap it. She set it down on the desk, perpendicular to the edge, like a small surrender. That's it, Vivienne said quietly. That's the argument. That's been the argument the whole time. You just needed permission to say it out loud. Emily let out a breath she had been holding for 2 years. The defense was scheduled for Thursday. Emily spent the next 3 days doing something she had never done before. She cut whole sections of her thesis without asking anyone's permission. She rewrote the final chapter from scratch, starting not with a quote but with her own voice. She did not send drafts to Vivienne for approval. She just wrote, and when she was done, she printed the whole thing out and read it cover to cover on her kitchen floor at 2 a.m, eating ginger biscuits and crying a little, but not from fear, from relief. Thursday arrived cold and gray. Emily wore the blazer she had bought at the vintage market, the one with the slightly too long sleeves that she had never had occasion to wear. She stood outside the conference room with her laptop and her printed copy, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Vivienne was already inside. Emily could see her through the small window in the door, sitting at the far end of the table, talking to the other 2 committee members. She looked the way she always looked, composed, untouchable, the ice queen of the comparative literature department. Then Vivienne glanced up, saw Emily through the glass, and smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, gone in a second, but it was real, and it was only for Emily, and it was enough. Emily opened the door. The defense lasted 90 minutes. Emily answered every question. She did not apologize for her arguments. She did not qualify her claims into mush. She said, "I believe," and "my research suggests," and "the evidence indicates." And she watched the other committee members nod. And she watched Vivienne sit very still, the corner of her mouth turned up just slightly. When it was over, the chair of the committee shook her hand and said, "Dr. Hart, that was a pleasure." Emily did not cry. She held it together all the way down the hallway, past teen department office, past the graduate student lounge where she had spent so many sleepless nights, down the stairs and out into the cold air. She stood on the steps of the building and let the wind hit her face. She had done it. She had actually done it. She turned to go back inside for her bag and saw Vivienne standing in the doorway holding it. "You forgot this," Vivienne said. Emily took the bag. Their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away immediately. "Thank you," Emily said, "for everything, for failing me the first time, for the bench, for the red pen, for listening." Vivienne's expression flickered. Something complicated moved behind her eyes. "Come to my office," she said. "There's something I want to show you." Vivienne's office was exactly the same as it had been that first day. The antique pens in their glass case, the black and white movie posters, the stack of student theses on the corner of the desk, which now had Emily's on top. But Vivienne did not sit at her desk. She walked to the bookshelf, the one on the far wall, the one Emily had never looked at closely. She reached to the top shelf and pulled down a thin volume with a faded blue cover. "Read the dedication," Vivienne said. Emily opened the book. On the first page, in careful script, "For Vivienne, the only person who ever made me think I could write." "Who?" Emily started. "Turn to page 47, Vivienne said. Emily turned. It was an essay on narrative silence in post-war American fiction. The argument was hauntingly familiar. The same structure, the same central insight, the same language about gaps in stories being structures, not absences. Emily looked up. Her hands were shaking. "This is your thesis," Vivienne said quietly. "Before you wrote it, before I ever read a word of yours, the person I loved most in the world wrote this." Same argument. Same sources. Same impossible, stubborn belief that the silences matter more than the words. Emily stared at her. "Marissa," Vivienne said. The name came out like a bruise, like something that had been pressed on for too long and had finally been given permission to surface. "She was my wife. She died 3 years ago. Breast cancer. She was a scholar, a brilliant one, and she never got to finish this book." Vivienne reached out and touched the page. Her fingers rested on a paragraph near the bottom, where the paper was worn almost transparent from being touched again and again. "The first time I read your draft," Vivienne said, "I thought I was hallucinating. You had written the same argument she had been working on when she died. Not copied. You had never seen this. You had arrived at it on your own, the same way she did, through the same winding path of doubt and curiosity. And I sat in this office, and I read your words, and I had to put the paper down because I was crying, and I could not remember the last time I had cried." Emily felt tears on her own face. She had not noticed when they started. "I failed your thesis twice," Vivienne said. "Part of it was because it genuinely was not ready, but part of it was because I was terrified. I was terrified that if I let your thesis pass, if I helped you finish it, you would finish it and leave, and I would lose this. The only thing that had made me feel close to her in 3 years. That's why you said the way I lost," Emily whispered. "In my apartment, when you almost told me." Vivienne nodded. Her jaw was tight. "I have not said her name out loud in almost a year," Emily looked down at the book in her hands, at the dedication, at the worn page, at the argument that had come to her in the dark, in the fear, in the late nights of doubt, and had turned out to be the same argument that a woman she had never met had also believed with her whole heart. She closed the book gently. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Vivienne looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, not quite. "I think," Vivienne said, "I have been waiting for someone to say that to me for longer than I realized." Emily set the book down on the desk, next to the antique pen she had held in Vivienne's apartment. She looked at the pen, then at Vivienne. "This pen," she said. "Was it hers?" Vivienne nodded. "She wrote the whole book with it. I keep it there because it still has her fingerprints on it." "That sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't," Emily said. "It sounds like love." The word hung in the air between them. Vivienne took a step closer, then another. They were standing very close now, in the quiet office, with the rain starting again against the window, and the worn blue book on the desk, and the pen that had held a dead woman's fingerprints for 3 years. "Emily," Vivienne said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I have spent 3 years making sure I would never feel this way about anyone again. And then you left a cup of tea and a ginger biscuit outside my door, and I have been undone ever since." Emily reached out and took Vivienne's hand. It was trembling. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said again. "Not after graduation. Not after you stop being my professor. Not ever." Vivienne closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She did not pull her hand away. The morning of graduation was the kind of May day that made New York feel like a gift. The sky was a soft, endless blue, and the cherry trees along the Columbia walkways were dropping petals like confetti. Emily stood in front of her dorm room mirror, adjusting the collar of her grandmother's vintage blazer. It was the same blazer she had worn to her defense. She had thought about buying something new, something that said academic or professional or ready for the future. But in the end, she had pulled this one from the back of her closet, brushed the lint off the shoulders, and decided that the person who had passed that defense was the person she wanted to bring into whatever came next. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, a text from Marcus. "Break a leg, kid, though honestly at this point you've already won, M." She smiled, typed back a quick thank you, and then hesitated. There was another message she wanted to send, but she had been holding off all morning. She wanted to see Vivienne in person. She wanted to see her face. She had not seen Vivienne since the afternoon in the office 3 days ago. They had texted, briefly, small things, sleep, you too, remember to eat, I made pasta. Emily had laughed at that one, alone in her room, with her heart doing something complicated and warm in her chest. The ceremony was held on the main lawn, rows of folding chairs, families with cameras, the low hum of a string quartet tuning up. Emily found her seat among the other master's students, most of them people she had barely talked to all year. They nodded at her, and she nodded back, and she thought about how strange it was that she was graduating with people who knew her name but not her story. She scanned the crowd for Vivienne. It took her a moment. The faculty were seated on a raised platform at the front, in their robes, and among them, near the end of the row, was Vivienne. She wore her doctoral gilding, the velvet trim, a deep blue. And she looked, Emily thought, impossibly composed. Her hair was pinned back, her hands were folded in her lap. She was not looking at Emily, she was looking at the cherry trees. The speeches began. The dean said something about perseverance and the future. A guest speaker said something about the world needing thoughtful minds. Emily heard none of it. She kept her eyes on the back of Vivienne's head, on the long way Vivienne's shoulders rose and fell with her breathing, on the way she adjusted her cuff once, twice, 3 times. Vivienne was nervous. Emily had never seen her nervous before. When the names were called, one by one, Emily's heart began to pound. She gripped the edge of her seat. She watched the students ahead of her walk across the stage, shake hands, receive their diplomas, and she thought, this is it. This is the moment I have been afraid of and desperate for the whole year. Heart, Emily. Her name echoed across the lawn. She stood. She walked. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but she kept moving, up the steps, across the stage, toward the dean, who shook her hand and said, "Congratulations, Dr. Hart." She almost laughed. She caught herself. She took the diploma, turned toward the audience, and in that brief second, her eyes found Vivienne's. Vivienne was standing now in the faculty row, and she was clapping. Her hands were moving slowly, deliberately, and her face was doing something Emily had never seen before. She was smiling. Not the small, controlled smile she used in meetings, not the dry, clinical smile she used in the classroom. It was a real smile, wide and unguarded, and it made her look 10 years younger. Emily's chest tightened. She held Vivienne's gaze for 1 heartbeat, then 2. Then she walked off the stage back to her seat, with the diploma in her hands and the sound of Vivienne's applause still ringing in her ears. Afterward, there was a reception on the lawn. Tables of fruit and cheese, a punch bowl, clusters of proud families. Emily drifted through it, accepting hugs from her fellow students, taking photos with people she would probably never see again. She looked for Vivienne, but she had disappeared from the faculty row. She was about to give up and check her phone when she felt a light touch on her elbow. She turned. Vivienne was standing there, out of her gown, back in a simple gray dress, holding a small rectangular box wrapped in brown paper. She looked different without the robes, softer, more human. "Congratulations, Dr. Hart," she said. Emily laughed. "You sound like the dean." "The dean doesn't mean it the way I do." Vivienne's voice was quiet, but her eyes were steady. She held out the box. "I have a small something for you." Emily took it. Her hands felt clumsy. She unwrapped the paper carefully, and when she lifted the lid, she stopped breathing. It was the pen, the antique pen from Vivienne's desk, the one that had written the blue book, the one that had held Marissa's fingerprints for 3 years. "I know it's not practical," Vivienne said quickly, her voice slightly rushed. "It's more of a symbolic thing. But I thought—" She stopped, swallowed. "I thought you should have it. Because you wrote your own story. You didn't let anyone else's version of you write it." Emily's eyes burned. She looked down at the pen, at the small gold nib, at the worn barrel, and she thought about all the nights she had spent crying over her thesis, all the times she had wanted to quit, all the times she had thought she was not smart enough, not good enough, not worthy of this degree. And then she thought about the woman standing in front of her who had failed her twice and then had shown up at her door in the rain and had helped her rewrite everything. "Vivienne," she said, her voice cracked. "Don't cry," Vivienne said. "You'll make me cry, and I have a reputation to maintain." Emily laughed, a wet, shaky laugh. She set the box down on the table, and before she could think about what she was doing, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Vivienne. Vivienne went very still, and then slowly her arms came up and she hugged Emily back. It was not a stiff, careful hug. It was a real one. Her face pressed against Emily's shoulder, and Emily felt her exhale, long and slow, like she had been holding her breath for 3 years. "You kept the pen," Emily murmured into her hair. "I kept it because it reminded me of her," Vivienne said, her voice muffled. "And then after a while I kept it because it reminded me of you." They stood like that for a long moment while the reception buzzed around them, while the cherry petals drifted past, while the spring sun warmed their shoulders. Emily could feel Vivienne's heart beating against her own chest. It was fast, it was real. When they finally pulled apart, Vivienne's cheeks were wet. She wiped at them with the back of her hand, embarrassed, and Emily caught her wrist gently. "Hey," she said, "look at me." Vivienne looked at her. "So what do I call you now?" Emily asked, "now that you're not my professor?" Vivienne's smile was small and fragile and completely honest. "Vivienne," she said. Emily turned the nib over in her mouth. It tasted like a beginning. "Okay," she said. "Vivienne." They walked out of the reception together, away from the tables and the punch and the families, down the path lined with cherry trees. Vivienne's hand brushed against Emily's, once, lightly. Emily didn't pull away. She laced their fingers together, gently, deliberately, and Vivienne let her. They walked like that for a while, in the spring sunshine, with the petals falling around them and the city humming in the distance. Neither of them said anything about what this meant, or what came next, or how they would navigate the complicated territory of a former student and a former professor. of two people who had found each other in the middle of a disaster. They didn't need to. Not yet. They had time. For the first time in a long time, they both had time. We didn't immediately talk about what came next, or how to navigate the messy reality of a former student and her professor. As we walked away from the ceremony under the falling cherry blossoms, I just laced my fingers through hers. We didn't need to have all the answers figured out today, because for the first time in a long time, we simply had time.